When 67-year-old Margaret Thompson received that phone call at 6 in the morning on a cold Tuesday in March, she never imagined her life was about to change forever. The old rotary phone beside her bed rang with that sharp, jarring sound that cut through the silence of her farmhouse like a knife through butter, startling her from the restless sleep that had become her unwelcome companion since Harold's passing. On the other end of the line, a trembling voice said, "Mrs. Thompson, we found a dog on your property. He's in critical condition, but there's something very special about him that you need to see." Margaret gripped the heavy black receiver with shaking hands, her bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor that Harold had installed with such pride 30 years ago, looking out the frost-covered window of her farm in Millfield, Ohio, where the last morning mists still danced over the golden fields like ghostly dancers celebrating the dawn. The familiar scent of her lavender sachets mixed with the lingering aroma of yesterday's coffee, creating a bittersweet perfume that reminded her of countless mornings shared with her beloved husband. She had no idea she was about to discover the true meaning of a miracle. Margaret had lost her husband Harold just 8 months before, on a crisp October day, when the maple trees surrounding their property were ablaze with colors of fire and gold, nature's final celebration before winter's embrace. 42 years of marriage had vanished in the blink of an eye when cancer took him that dark autumn, leaving behind only the lingering scent of his favorite pipe tobacco in the curtains and the echo of his gentle laughter in the empty rooms. Now, alone on her 15-acre farm that stretched from the weathered red barn to the creek that babbled with spring runoff, she woke up every morning to the deafening silence that had replaced the familiar sound of Harold's heavy work boots coming down the creaky wooden stairs that groaned under his weight, the comforting noise of the old electric coffee maker being turned on at exactly 5:30, with its familiar gurgling and hissing, and his deep, melodious voice humming old country songs like Tennessee Waltz and Blue Moon of Kentucky, while he prepared breakfast with the care of a man who had learned to cook during his bachelor days before meeting her. The house, built in 1952 by Harold himself, with his calloused hands and stubborn determination, using lumber from trees he'd felled on their own property, now seemed too big, too empty, too full of memories that whispered from every corner. The aroma of fried bacon sizzling in the old cast-iron skillet and strong coffee percolating in the blue enamel pot that used to fill the kitchen every morning had been replaced by the neutral, sterile scent of loneliness and the faint mustiness that creeps into houses where only one person lives. Margaret found herself eating plain toast with strawberry jam from the preserves she and Harold had made together last summer, sitting in silence at the hand-crafted oak table that Harold had built as a wedding gift, staring at the empty ladder-back chair across from her where Harold used to sit every morning for 4 decades, always with his weathered straw hat hanging on the back like a faithful sentinel, his reading glasses perched on the brim, and yesterday's farming almanac folded neatly beside his coffee cup that bore the faded logo of the local feed store. The morning sunlight streaming through the gingham curtains, she had sewn herself cast shadows that seemed to mock the emptiness of his chair. That March morning, when the phone rang with its insistent demand for attention, Margaret was contemplating yet another empty day ahead, another 16 hours to fill with meaningless tasks that felt like trying to hold water in her bare hands. She had developed a melancholic routine that gave structure to her grief-stricken days, feeding the chickens at dawn when the air was crisp and filled with the earthy scent of dew-soaked soil, their excited clucking and flapping wings the only sounds breaking the morning stillness, as she scattered feed corn from the old galvanized bucket that had served 3 generations of Thompson chickens, watering the small vegetable garden that Harold had lovingly tended for decades with rows of tomatoes, green beans, and sweet corn planted with military precision, each furrow straight as an arrow, and spaced exactly 18 inches apart the way his father had taught him, and then sitting on the wraparound front porch, with its white-painted railings and hanging ferns and macrame planters, with a cup of chamomile tea that never quite warmed the chill in her bones, watching cars occasionally pass by on the dusty rural road that stretched endlessly toward town, each vehicle carrying strangers, living lives filled with purpose and direction that seemed to mock her aimless existence. The call was from Jake Morrison, the local veterinarian who had known the Thompson family for decades, a kind man whose gentle hands had delivered countless foals and calves on farms throughout Fairfield County, his voice as familiar as an old hymn sung in the Methodist church, where Margaret and Harold had been married on a spring day in 1980, when the dogwoods were blooming and the air smelled of apple blossoms and new beginnings. His voice carried an urgency mixed with hope and something else she couldn't quite identify, as he explained that a dog had been found at the edge of her property, near the massive old oak tree that had stood sentinel for over a century, its gnarled branches reaching toward heaven like arthritic fingers. The same tree where Harold used to rest during scorching hot summer days when the corn grew tall and green, reading his farming magazines and agricultural reports while sipping sweet tea from mason jar beaded with condensation, watching their crops sway in the gentle breeze that carried the scent of growing things and rich black earth. Margaret, this dog, he's badly hurt, but there's something in his eyes. It's like he's been waiting for someone specific. When I mentioned it was your property, he tried to lift his head. Can you come down here? Margaret put on her navy blue wool coat with its worn cuffs and loose button that she kept meaning to fix. The same one Harold had given her for Christmas in 1998, wrapped in red paper with a silver bow, the one that still smelled faintly of his Old Spice cologne, mixed with the sweet aroma of hay and honest sweat when she buried her face in the collar during her loneliest moments, and drove her old Ford pickup truck with its dented tailgate and rust spots that Harold had always promised to fix next weekend, down the familiar gravel road that crunched under the worn tires, past the Hendersons' dairy farm where black and white Holstein cows grazed peacefully in pastures dotted with dandelions, past the abandoned Miller place where vines had claimed the front porch and morning glories grew wild through broken windows, to the veterinary clinic in town that sat on the corner of Main Street and Elm like a beacon of hope for every farmer and pet owner in 3 counties. The 20-minute drive through the rolling Ohio countryside had never seemed so long, each mile marker appearing to mock her with its slow progress as she passed fields where winter wheat was beginning to show green shoots pushing through the dark soil, farmhouses with smoke curling from chimneys like gray ribbons against the pale morning sky, and red barns weathered to the color of dried blood standing proud against landscapes painted in shades of brown and gold that reminded her of Harold's favorite flannel shirt. Her heart was beating irregularly, skipping and stuttering like an old engine that needed tuning, a sensation she hadn't experienced since those terrifying nights in the sterile hospital corridors that smelled of industrial disinfectant and despair when Harold was fighting his final battle against the disease that was slowly stealing him away, one labored breath at a time. Have you ever wondered how life's paths lead us exactly where we need to be? Sometimes, when we think we've lost everything, the universe prepares something extraordinary for us. Dr. Morrison's clinic was on Main Street, nestled between the old Williamson Pharmacy with its hand-painted wooden sign that had weathered 40 summers and 40 winters, where Mrs. Williamson still filled prescriptions behind the same mahogany counter her grandfather had installed in 1923, and Murphy's hardware store that had been family-owned since 1963, its wooden floors creaking under decades of farmers' boots, and its air thick with the smell of fertilizer, seed packets, and the metal tang of tools and nails stored in wooden bins that Harold used to browse through like a child in a candy store. The red brick building that housed the clinic had the characteristic medicinal smell of antiseptic and antibiotics, mixed with the comforting aroma of pet food, fresh sawdust from the kennel runs, and that indefinable scent of hope and healing that seemed to permeate every surface, from the worn linoleum floors to the acoustic ceiling tiles stained by decades of Ohio humidity. Margaret pushed open the heavy glass door with its metal handle worn smooth by thousands of worried hands, making the bronze bell ring softly with a musical tone that reminded her of the little brass bell Harold had hung on their back door to announce visitors, a sound that had always made her smile because it reminded him of his grandmother's farmhouse in Kentucky, where she had spent magical summers as a child, learning to churn butter and gather eggs from hens that seemed to know her name. "He's in the back room, Margaret," said Dr. Morrison, a gentleman of 58 whose weathered hands bore the scars of countless animal encounters, and whose eyes held infinite compassion behind wire-rimmed glasses that perched on a nose broken years ago by a nervous stallion, the same glasses he had worn the day he helped Harold choose their first buddy from a litter of golden retriever puppies born in a barn that smelled of fresh hay and new life. "I need to warn you, he's quite weak. Looks like he's been lost for weeks, maybe months, but there's something remarkable about his spirit." They walked down the narrow hallway lined with cheerful animal posters and framed thank-you letters from grateful pet owners. The sound of Margaret's worn leather boots echoed against the white linoleum floor, mixing with the distant barking of other hospitalized dogs and the gentle hum of medical equipment. The familiar antiseptic smell brought back memories of Harold's final days, and Margaret had to steady herself against the wall. When Margaret entered the back room, her heart nearly stopped. There, lying on a red and blue checkered blanket that looked like something from a church picnic, was the most magnificent golden retriever she had ever seen. Despite his weakened condition, his golden coat still retained traces of its natural shine, like autumn wheat in late afternoon sunlight. His honey-brown eyes looked at her with an intensity that made her step back, but not from fear, from recognition. But there was something more, something that brought immediate tears to Margaret's blue eyes. Around the dog's neck, worn by time and weather, darkened by rain and sun, was a brown leather collar with a small metal tag that caught the fluorescent light. With trembling hands that reminded her of her mother's in her final years, Margaret approached and read the engraved name. Buddy. Buddy. The same name as the dog she and Harold had 40 years ago, when they were young newlyweds full of dreams and energy. That first Buddy had been a golden retriever identical to this one, who had accompanied them through their early years of marriage, through the birth of their children, through quiet evenings on the porch, and who had passed peacefully on an autumn afternoon in 1985, leaving a hole in their hearts that they thought would never heal. "Harold always said that someday we'd have another Buddy," Margaret whispered to herself, her voice choked with emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. Dr. Morrison, who knew the family's history well and had been the one to help them say goodbye to their first Buddy all those years ago, simply nodded silently, understanding the profound moment unfolding before him. The dog, this new Buddy, tried to lift his head when he heard her voice. His eyes seemed to recognize her, as if he had been waiting for her his entire life, as if some cosmic force had been guiding him to this exact moment, to this exact person. Margaret knelt beside the makeshift stretcher, her knees protesting against the hard floor, and hesitantly extended her hand. Buddy gathered what little strength he had to lick her fingers with a rough but infinitely gentle tongue. In that moment, something awakened inside Margaret that she thought had died with Harold. It was as if a part of her heart that had been buried in that cemetery plot beside her husband began to beat again, slowly at first, then with growing strength and purpose. "Dr. Morrison," she said with a determination she hadn't felt in months, her voice stronger than it had been since Harold's funeral, "what does he need to get better?" The veterinarian explained that Buddy was severely malnourished and dehydrated, with some minor wounds that would need daily care and attention. His ribs showed through his matted coat, and his eyes were sunken from weeks of wandering and searching, but surprisingly, for a dog in his condition, all his vital organs were functioning well. With proper care, good nutrition, and lots of love, he can recover completely. But it will take time, patience, and dedication. Margaret didn't hesitate. The words came from somewhere deep inside her, from a place that had been dormant for too long. "I'm taking him home today." Sometimes saving someone is actually saving ourselves. Margaret didn't know it yet, but she was about to discover this in the most beautiful way possible. The drive back home was different from that morning's journey. Buddy was lying on the truck's back seat, wrapped in a soft blanket that smelled of lavender fabric softener, the same scent Margaret had used for decades because Harold loved how it made their sheets smell like his grandmother's house. She adjusted the rearview mirror to see him, and every time their eyes met in the reflection, she felt a familiar warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced since Harold's hand last squeezed hers. At home, Margaret prepared a special corner for Buddy in what had been Harold's office, a room filled with farming journals, seed catalogs, and the smell of pipe tobacco that still lingered in the curtains. She placed a soft bed near the window overlooking the cornfields, where the afternoon's golden light created comforting patterns on the wall, and where Buddy could watch the seasons change. The aroma of homemade chicken soup, the first meal she had cooked with genuine pleasure in months, soon filled the entire house, bringing life back to rooms that had felt like a museum. The first days were challenging in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. Buddy could barely eat, and she had to feed him small portions every 2 hours, sitting beside him on the floor, coaxing him with gentle words and patient hands. She found herself waking up in the middle of the night to check if he was breathing, a maternal concern she hadn't felt since her own children were small, decades ago when the house was full of laughter and chaos. But gradually, small miracles began to happen. On the 4th day, Buddy managed to walk unsteadily to the kitchen door, his tail making a feeble attempt at wagging. On the 7th day, he ate a complete portion of food without help, and Margaret actually clapped her hands in delight. On the 10th day, Margaret woke up with a strange sensation. It had been years since she felt watched in the morning. When she opened her eyes, she found Buddy sitting beside her bed, his tail wagging gently, his eyes bright with the first spark of health she had seen. "Good morning, my boy," she said, and her voice sounded different, lighter, more alive, carrying notes of joy that had been absent for too long. Buddy responded with a low, melodious bark, the first sound he had made since his arrival, a sound that seemed to echo through the empty house and fill it with hope. If you've also had an animal that changed your life unexpectedly, leave a comment telling your story. Sometimes, sharing these precious memories connects us in surprising ways. As the weeks passed, the transformation was extraordinary, and not just in Buddy. Margaret found herself humming while preparing the dog's meals, an activity that had become a pleasurable ritual that gave structure to her days. She rediscovered the joy of cooking, preparing not only Buddy's food, but proper meals for herself, too. Casseroles that filled the house with warmth, fresh bread that reminded her of Sunday mornings when Harold was alive, soups that simmered all day and made the kitchen feel like home again. Their routine developed naturally, like a dance they had always known. Every morning at 6 o'clock sharp, Buddy appeared beside Margaret's bed, no longer as the weak and haunted dog who had arrived, but as a strong and loyal companion whose presence had become as essential as breathing. They walked together to the kitchen, where Margaret prepared coffee in Harold's favorite mug, while Buddy sat patiently next to his bowl, waiting for breakfast with the dignity of a gentleman. What touched Margaret most deeply was how Buddy seemed to understand her emotions with an intuition that bordered on supernatural. On days when missing, Harold weighed heavier when she found herself looking at old photographs or holding one of his shirts that still carried his scent of aftershave and honest work. Buddy appeared silently at her side. He didn't try to distract or forcefully cheer her up. Instead, he simply placed his golden head on her lap and stayed there, a solid and comforting presence that seemed to absorb her pain and transform it into something bearable. One particularly difficult April afternoon, when spring was blooming outside but Margaret felt trapped in winter, she was organizing Harold's belongings in the dusty attic. Among his old work clothes and farming magazines, she found the collar of their first Buddy, worn smooth by years of love and adventure. Tears came instantly, carrying 40 years of memories with them. Memories of puppy training and long walks, of children playing in the yard with a patient golden retriever, of quiet evenings when Buddy would rest his head on Harold's lap while they watched the sunset from the porch. Current Buddy climbed the creaky stairs, something he had never done before, and found her sitting on the wooden floor, sobbing into her hands. He approached slowly, carefully, and with an almost human gentleness, placed his paw on her hand that held the old collar. Margaret looked into his brown eyes and saw something extraordinary, understanding that transcended species. It was as if he knew exactly who had been there before him, whom she had lost, and how everything was connected in ways that defied explanation. "You understand, don't you?" she whispered, stroking his now shiny and silky coat. "You know why you were waiting for me. How many times do we lose something or someone and think we'll never feel that completeness again? But life has a mysterious way of sending us exactly what we need when we least expect it." Buddy's complete recovery coincided with Summer's arrival in Ohio. By June, he wasn't just healthy, but radiant. His golden coat shone under the Midwest sun like spun gold, and his eyes had regained all the typical liveliness and intelligence of his breed. More importantly, Margaret had recovered something she thought she had lost forever: the ability to genuinely smile, to laugh at his antics when he chased butterflies in the garden, to feel joy bubble up from somewhere deep inside her chest. They developed a morning routine that became sacred, a ritual that connected them to the land and to each other. Every morning at 5:30, just as the sun began to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, they went out together for a walk through the fields surrounding the property. The fresh air carried the scent of clover and wildflowers, honeysuckle and fresh-turned earth, and Buddy ran ahead with boundless energy, always making sure Margaret was following, always circling back to check on her. These walks became meditation moments for her, a way to start each day with gratitude and wonder. It was during one of these morning walks at the end of June, when the corn was knee-high and the world felt full of possibility, that something extraordinary happened. They were passing by the old oak tree, the same massive tree where Buddy had been found, its trunk scarred by decades of storms, but still standing strong, when he stopped abruptly. His ears perked up in alert attention, and he began gently digging at the base of the tree, his paws working methodically at the rich, dark earth. "What is it, boy?" Margaret approached, curiosity overcoming her usual caution. Buddy continued digging with purpose until he exposed something buried shallow in the soil. A small tin box, rusty and weathered by time, but still intact. The metal was green with age, and it looked like it had been there for decades. With her heart racing and hands trembling with anticipation, Margaret picked up the box. Inside, wrapped in plastic that had somehow kept the contents dry through countless seasons, was a handwritten letter and a faded black and white photograph. The photo showed a young uniformed soldier, barely more than a boy, holding a golden retriever that looked exactly like the Buddy who now stood beside her, watching with intelligent eyes, as if he knew the significance of this moment. The letter, written in careful handwriting with a fountain pen, bore the letterhead of the U.S. Army and was dated May 15, 1967. To whoever finds Buddy, my name is James Mitchell, and I'm leaving for Vietnam next month. If something happens to me, please take care of my dog. He's the best friend a man can have, loyal and true and full of love. I'm burying this letter here under his favorite tree where we spent countless afternoons, hoping that someday someone special will find him or one of his descendants. Buddy has always had the gift of finding people who need love as much as he does. He seems to know when someone's heart is broken. Please love him as much as I have. James Mitchell, 2nd Lieutenant, U.S. Army, 153rd Airborne Brigade. Margaret sat heavily in the grass, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The date on the letter was almost 57 years ago. Buddy, not this Buddy, but his ancestors, had been waiting for decades for someone special. And somehow, mysteriously, this lineage of love had found its way to her through generations of faithful dogs who carried in their DNA the capacity for unconditional love and healing. Do you believe in destiny? Sometimes life's connections are so deep they go beyond what we can understand. If this story is touching your heart, leave a yes in the comments. That evening, Margaret called Dr. Morrison and told him about the incredible discovery. Her voice shook with emotion as she read the letter over the phone. Together, they researched James Mitchell and discovered the heartbreaking truth. He had been declared missing in action in December 1968, just 6 months after arriving in Vietnam. He never returned to claim his beloved Buddy. But somehow, through generations of descendants, through careful breeding and the mysterious ways of the universe, the promise of love and companionship had continued. Margaret realized with stunning clarity that she and Buddy hadn't met by chance. They were united by an invisible chain of love that stretched across decades, connecting a lonely young soldier preparing for war, a veteran who never made it home, a widow drowning in grief, and a dog who carried in his very essence the infinite capacity to love and heal broken hearts. Summer passed like a golden dream, painted in watercolors. Margaret and Buddy became familiar and beloved figures in the small community of Millfield. Every afternoon, they could be seen walking down Main Street, she in her favorite blue floral dress that Harold had always complimented, and Buddy walking majestically beside her with the confidence of a dog who knew he was loved. They greeted neighbors and made friends, spreading a quiet joy wherever they went. The local department store, Murphy & Sons, even started keeping a special jar of dog treats behind the counter specifically for when Buddy appeared with Margaret. Old Mrs. Patterson at the post office always saved him a pat and a kind word. The children waiting for the school bus would run over to pet him, and Buddy would stand patiently tail wagging as small hands explored his soft fur. Harold Morrison, Jr., the veterinarian's son who had recently returned from veterinary college with dreams of taking over his father's practice, commented to his father one afternoon, "It's incredible how Mrs. Thompson has changed. She looks 20 years younger, and there's light in her eyes again." And it was absolutely true. Margaret had rediscovered not only joy, but a renewed sense of purpose that energized her in ways she hadn't felt since Harold's diagnosis. She began volunteering at the county animal shelter 3 days a week, using her experience with Buddy to help other injured and abandoned animals find loving families. Buddy always accompanied her, serving as a gentle ambassador who helped other frightened dogs trust humans again, showing them through his calm presence that love was possible. In September, when the leaves began their spectacular transformation into shades of red, orange, and gold, Margaret received an unexpected visit that would add another layer to Buddy's remarkable story. Mary Wilson, a 45-year-old woman from Columbus, had driven 2 hours to meet her after hearing about the letter through the local newspaper, which had picked up the heartwarming story. Mary explained, with tears in her eyes, that her grandmother had told her countless stories about James Mitchell. He was her great-uncle, her grandfather's beloved younger brother, who had left for war and never returned. "The Mitchell family always had golden retrievers," Mary said, sitting in Margaret's living room while Buddy slept peacefully at both their feet, his gentle snoring providing a comforting soundtrack to their conversation. Grandma used to say that Uncle James had made a promise before he left, that his dogs would always find their way to special people who needed them most. She said it was like a blessing he put on his bloodline. Mary reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope filled with precious photographs and documents she had brought to share. Margaret served tea in her finest porcelain cups, the china set she had received as a wedding gift and had kept stored since Harold's death, and they spent the entire afternoon sharing stories and memories. Mary showed Margaret more photos of James and his dogs through the years, pictures of family gatherings where golden retrievers were always present, tales of dogs who had found their way to lonely widows, struggling families, and children who needed a friend. "You know," Mary said as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, "Grandma always said that true love never really dies. It just finds new ways to manifest itself, new channels to flow through. I think Uncle James would be incredibly happy knowing his promise is still being kept after all these years." That night, Margaret sat on the front porch with Buddy beside her, watching the sunset paint the Ohio sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The air was filled with the sweet aroma of freshly cut hay and the distant sound of crickets beginning their nightly symphony. A gentle breeze carried the scent of approaching autumn, and Margaret felt a peace she hadn't known in months. "Harold," she whispered to the gentle wind, her words carried away into the vast sky, "thank you for sending Buddy to me. I know somehow you had a hand in this." As if understanding every word, Buddy placed his warm head on her lap, his eyes reflecting the last golden lights of the day, and Margaret felt the presence of all the love that had gone before. Harold's love, James Mitchell's love, and the endless chain of love that connected all living things. Autumn brought a bittersweet beauty to the Thompson farm that reminded Margaret of a painting she had once seen in a museum. The trees around the property exploded in vibrant colors that took her breath away, creating a natural cathedral of red, orange, and yellow that crunched softly under her and Buddy's feet during their morning walks. The air carried the nostalgic scent of wood smoke from neighbors' chimneys and the earthy smell of leaves returning to the soil. It was on one of these October mornings, when frost still kissed the grass and the air was sharp and clean, that Margaret had a profound revelation that would change how she saw her entire life. They were standing again by the old oak tree, now marked by a small bronze plaque she had commissioned in honor of James Mitchell and his original Buddy, when something shifted inside her heart. "You know, my boy," she said, her breath visible in small puffs in the cool air. I thought my love story had ended when Harold left this world. But you taught me that love doesn't end. It transforms, finds new paths, discovers new ways to exist and flourish. Buddy looked at her with those wise eyes that seemed to hold the accumulated wisdom of all the dogs who had come before him, as if understanding every word. Margaret continued, her voice filled with wonder at her own discovery. Harold loved me for 42 years as a husband, through good times and bad, through sickness and health. Now you love me in a different way, but equally deep and true. And I have so much love to give, to you, to the animals at the shelter, to neighbors who have become dear friends again. The realization washed over her like warm sunlight. Love wasn't a finite resource that could be depleted. It was renewable, expandable, capable of taking new forms and touching new lives. Harold's love hadn't disappeared when he died. It had transformed, creating space in her heart for new kinds of love to flourish. If you've experienced this kind of transformative love, whether through an animal, a special person, or even a rediscovery of yourself, you know how powerful it is. Share your experience. Your words might be exactly what someone needs to hear today. Winter arrived gently that year, like a soft blanket settling over the Ohio countryside. Margaret had feared this season above all others, as it was during the previous winter that Harold had become sicker, his body finally succumbing to the disease that had been quietly stealing him away. She had associated the short, cold days with loss and sadness, with the smell of hospitals and the sound of machines that couldn't save the man she loved. But with Buddy by her side, even December brought its own unique joys and discoveries. They created new rituals that honored both the season and their deepening bond. On long winter evenings, Margaret read aloud to Buddy from classic novels, biographies of remarkable people, and even recipes from cooking magazines that made her mouth water. Buddy lay at her feet, occasionally lifting his head as if really listening to every word, his presence making the empty house feel full again. The warmth from the fireplace filled the room with dancing shadows, and the comforting smell of burning oak logs, mixing with the aroma of hot chocolate topped with marshmallows and the scent of cinnamon candles that reminded Margaret of Christmases past. These quiet evenings became precious to her, moments of contentment she had thought were gone forever. On Christmas Day, Margaret didn't feel the crushing loneliness that had nearly destroyed her the year before. Instead, she prepared a special Christmas dinner for Buddy. A small turkey breast seasoned with herbs from her garden, cut into perfect bite-sized pieces and mixed with his favorite kibble. They dined together at the kitchen table, she with her modest but delicious meal for one, he with his holiday feast served in Harold's old ceramic bowl. "Merry Christmas, Buddy," she toasted with her glass of wine, raising it toward the ceiling where she imagined Harold might be watching. And Buddy responded with a soft, musical bark that sounded almost like "thank you," and filled the room with more joy than any expensive gift could have provided. Today, nearly a year after that life-changing phone call on a cold March morning, Margaret Thompson wakes up every day with purpose, energy, and hope. At 68, she has rediscovered that life still has countless gifts to offer, countless reasons to smile, countless opportunities to love and be loved. Buddy, now with a gleaming golden coat and bright, healthy eyes that sparkle with intelligence and mischief, continues to be her faithful companion in all adventures, both large and small. They have become an inseparable team at the county animal shelter, where Margaret volunteers 4 days a week and has become something of a local legend. Buddy seems to have inherited the ancestral gift of recognizing people and animals who need healing, and together they have helped more than 50 animals find loving homes. Margaret has a special touch with the most damaged and frightened animals. Perhaps because she understands what it feels like to be lost and found again. The Thompson farm is no longer a silent monument to grief and loss. It has been transformed into a refuge of hope and healing, where the sound of happy barking mixes with genuine laughter, where the aroma of homemade dog treats competes with the smell of fresh flowers in mason jars throughout the house, where life has returned in all its messy, beautiful glory. Margaret framed James Mitchell's letter and placed it on the kitchen wall in a place of honor, right next to a black and white photo of her with Harold on their wedding day and a new color photo of her with Buddy taken on his first healthy day. 3 generations of love, connected by an invisible but unbreakable thread that stretches across time and circumstance. "You know, Buddy," she said on a recent golden spring afternoon, as they watched the first green shoots of Harold's carefully planted garden push through the rich soil, "I think I finally understand the most important truth of all. Love never really leaves us. It just waits patiently for the right moment, the right form, the right heart to return to." Buddy wagged his tail and gently licked her hand, as he always did when she spoke about matters of the heart. And Margaret knew with absolute certainty that her love story hadn't ended with Harold's death. It had simply begun a beautiful new chapter that she never could have imagined. Sometimes miracles come in the most unexpected forms. Sometimes they arrive hurt and scared, needing as much healing as we do. And sometimes they teach us the most profound lesson of all, that the human heart has an infinite capacity to love again, in ways we never dreamed possible, connecting us to others across time and space in the eternal dance of love that makes life worth living. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know. Leave a comment sharing how animals have impacted your life. Or simply leave a like if you believe in the transformative power of unconditional love. Thank you for allowing me to share Margaret and Buddy's story with you. Until next time, remember, love always finds a way back to us.